Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Danny Lichtenfeld, Director of the Brattleboro Museum. My pleasure to be your host for tonight's presentation by Curtis Reed, Jr. on the Vermont African American Heritage Trail, followed by a Q&A with all of you. This is the fourth and final event in a series we've been presenting this spring in connection with the exhibit Children of the Sun, which opened at the Brattleboro Museum on March 18th and is on view through June 13th. That exhibit features artwork by Jennifer Mack-Watkins and a poem by Fahmi Shakur, and it was curated by David Rios Ferreira. It's Jennifer's first solo museum show, and all of us at the museum feel very grateful and privileged to have the opportunity to share Jennifer's work with our community and the wider world. When Jennifer was invited by curator David Rios Ferreira to create artwork for an exhibition in Brattleboro, she did a deep dive into the history of African Americans in Vermont. It wasn't long before she encountered an indispensable resource, the African American Heritage Trail, which in turn led her to the story of Daisy Turner, which became an important source of inspiration for the artwork that Jennifer eventually created for her exhibit. It's safe to say that we have Curtis Reed Jr. of Brattleboro to thank for the existence of the Vermont African American Heritage Trail. So when we worked with Jennifer on programming related to her exhibit, it seemed like a no-brainer that we should take this opportunity to learn more about Curtis and the Vermont African American Heritage Trail. So in just a moment, I'm going to ask Curtis to come join me on screen. The plan is that he's going to speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then we will open it up to your questions and comments. If you'd like to submit a question or comment, if you're here on Zoom, please use the Q&A button on your screen. Better to use that than the chat button. It's a little hard for me to keep track of the questions and things that are submitted in the chat, so please use the Q&A button. You can submit your comments and questions at any time, but we'll get to them at the end of the talk. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, you can type your questions or comments there, and we'll keep an eye on that too. Okay, with that housekeeping taken care of, I'd like to ask Curtis to turn on his camera and mic now, and while he's joining, I will tell you a bit more about him. Curtis Reed Jr. is president of the CRJ Consulting Group and executive director of the Vermont Partnership for Fairness and Diversity. He provides expert training and coaching on inclusion, bias, and equity to state agencies, municipal, institutional, and business clients, as well as community organizations across Vermont. He serves as chair of the Vermont Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights and sits on statewide commissions dealing with law enforcement, education, and minority health issues. Curtis is the driving force behind 4 statewide initiatives: the Vermont African American Heritage Trail, the Vermont Vision for a Multicultural Future, I Am a Vermonter, and the think tank for Vermont Leaders of Color. After 18 years of working and living overseas in Arabic, Portuguese, and French-speaking countries, Curtis returned to Vermont in 2001. His consulting experience spans 4 decades in both international and domestic markets. In 2015, the School for International Training Graduate Institute awarded Curtis a Doctorate of Humane Letters for his life's work to make Vermont a desirable destination for everyone. Curtis, it's wonderful to see you. Thank you for your work on behalf of all Vermonters, and thanks so much for being here tonight.
Danny, thank you. And I thank the museum for giving me an opportunity to really talk about the trail. Most people want a 20-second soundbite for a television interview or a 2-minute interview for the print.
Right.
So to have 45 minutes to talk about the trail, you know, is like having a kid in a candy store. So thank you for
that. You're very welcome, and thank you. We can't wait to hear all about it, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions for you afterwards too. So I'm going to exit the screen now and just leave it to you. And when you're ready for the Q&A, just give a holler and I'll come back on for that.
Okay, great. Thank you. So The African American Heritage Trail has a really sort of interesting history, but let me talk about Vermont Partnership first, in that our vision for the state of Vermont is that it become the model for inclusive thought and practice in the United States. And our work is really visionary in terms of a long-term strategy. We tell all of our partners to suppress their socialization around instant gratification. But this is a long-term process. And we approach our work not from a social or moral perspective, but more out of an economic necessity. And I say that because I don't want to have to pay more taxes than I have to. And in order for us to make that happen, we need to grow Vermont's population, and we need to grow Vermont's economic pie. And all of the work of our client partners really focuses on the economic underpinnings around diversity, inclusion, and equity. We have that lofty goal at 30,000 feet, which is situating Vermont as the epicenter of inclusive thought practice. And we etched this out 18 years ago. We're actually in year 18 of our 40-year initiative, Vermont Vision for a Multicultural Future. And understanding that we need to operate and function in a paradigm-busting, nonlinear fashion in order to move us collectively in the direction of our stated goal, of our vision. At about 20,000 foot level, our sort of mission statements focus on making Vermont a desirable, if not the most desirable destination for folks of color around the United States. And, previous to 2013, when the trail came online, the marketing strategy for the state of Vermont focused on white heterosexual males with family incomes of $120,000 or more. Now, we know, given the demographic shift that's occurring, and that has been occurring for decades now, that the population of white middle-class heterosexual males with family incomes of $120,000 or more, that population is shrinking. And yet, on the other hand, we have this exponential growth of people in communities of color around the United States. And so why not tap into that marketplace as well, to bring more visitors here, to provide an experience that might exceed their expectations, which is my own origin story about Vermont. And some of them may decide to stay here. So my own origin story began in 1978, the big nor'easter of 78, when a college buddy of mine lived in Newfane, invited me up to Vermont for cross-country skiing. I came, got off of the train, the Vermonter in Brattleboro at 2 a.m. in the morning, trudged up the hill with 3 other guys, and I sat in Dunkin' Donuts for 36 hours until he could get plowed out. But then I spent the next 3 weeks eating, drinking, and skiing in picture postcard perfect Vermont. And I said, wow, I want to move here. And 3 or 4 months later, I relocated to Brattleboro in the spring of 1979. We want to replicate that experience with more people in the hopes that they have that kind of experience that will land them here. And my story isn't necessarily unique. For the 60% of Vermont residents who were born someplace other than Vermont, we share in large part, in large measure, having had some sort of experience that exceeded our expectations for Vermont. And we decided to stay here, or we came back. And so we need to be able to do that on a much broader scale in the multicultural marketplace, the place where BIPOC consumers reside. The challenge with that is that a lot of people don't know about Vermont. A lot of Black and brown folks don't know that Vermont even exists. You know, I used to work for the Experiment International Living, and I travel all over the Western and Mountain States. And I would say, good afternoon, my name is Curtis Reed, I work for the Experiment, I'm from Vermont. And invariably someone would raise their hand and say, Vermont, what country is that in? I scratch my head and say, this is gonna be a long, long day. Well, and these were, for the most part, white audiences that I was talking to. When I spoke to audiences of largely Black and brown folks, whether in churches or in schools, I would get the same response. Where's Vermont? Where's that place? So to achieve the broader strategy of increasing our numbers of tourists, entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and others, we need to beat the drum. We needed something to beat the drum to say Vermont is a destination. And that event or that idea was the African American Heritage Trail. Now the trail itself had been an ideal form as early as the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s. We had a woman named Sarah Shard did a lot of research and discovered there were about 95 sites around the state of Vermont that had some relevancy to African American history. She probably completed that work in 2008, 2007, 2008. And we just sat on it because we didn't know where to go with it. There's no clear opportunity for how we would use that information, how we would create a trail. Then during the gubernatorial race of 2009, or was it 2010? Yeah, 2010, when Brian Doobie, his campaign slogan was Pure Vermont. And we took offense with the slogan, campaign slogan, Pure Vermont. He claimed, and his campaign claimed, that they were only talking about agricultural materials, agricultural products. But there's a double entendre there because, you know, for the Abenaki nation, you know, the genocide that was committed upon them was in the idea and the notion of to purify Vermont. When we look at, you know, African Americans, you know, that we want to purge the state of all Black and brown people as a lingering legacy of the 1910s and 1920s, when the Ku Klux Klan was arguably a very forceful political and social force in the state. So, you know, I tried to be tactful with the campaign, talked to people and said, yeah, this might not be a good idea, but they brushed me off. So I wrote this scathing editorial that appeared in all the papers around the state. And I get a call from Peter Shumlin. And Peter and I, we met at Amy's Cafe. And he said, Curtis, what can I do to not appear to be tone deaf when it comes to issues around race? And And so I laid out this idea for him of, expanding Vermont's economy by attracting more folks of color. But we needed the honey, we needed the hook to get folks here. And I said, it'd be great if the state would be a co-conspirator with us in the creation and maintenance of the Vermont African American Heritage Trail. Now, the reality is that we had existing sites, brick and mortar sites that already existed in the state. Hildene existed, Rokeby existed, the Old Stone House in Brownington existed, the Grafton Historical Society, the Brandon Historical Society. These were all places that already existed. The Justin Murrill Homestead, Constitution, these are places that already existed, but they were not connected. And so what we did, and I should say that that Peter, actively promoted this in his campaign as a way of expanding economic opportunity. And the day after he was elected, he called and said, I'm setting up a meeting with you and Lawrence Miller, who was at that time was the Secretary of Commerce and Community Development. And I did a presentation before his senior team. The response was they saw dollar signs. We had never thought that cultural tourism that was directed at the multicultural marketplace was even possible for us. And so we spent about 2 years winnowing through our list, winnowing through other lists to come up with an initial group of 16 sites. And again, the trail was created with a sort of bifurcated goal. The first of which was around economic development and tourism, expanding our economy into a marketplace that didn't know that Vermont even existed. And then the second one had to do with education, that our young people, our students, our own communities need to be aware of the important role that persons of African heritage played in the state, not only in the state, but in the creation of the state. The Green Mountain Boys were multiracial. There were communities of color in Woodstock and Heinsberg and other places around the state before independence, before the state's independence. So we believe it's really important that kids, particularly students, know this history and sort of bathe themselves in this history. One, for kids of color, for them to know that there's a place for them as adults in Vermont, that they could grow up to be a Martin Henry Freeman, or they could grow up to be an Alexander Twilight, or an Andrew Harris, who are all notable figures in Vermont's history. So it's that subliminal sort of education or exposure that says to young kids of color in the state of Vermont, there's a place for you here when you grow up, both in civic life and in government. It's also important for white kids to know this, because they can then begin to associate with their classmates of color. Oh, you could be, a college president, or you could be a legislator, or you could be an educator, so that they can also, as they begin to formulate what a future would look like, that future would be multicultural in its composition. So, Vermont's population, general population is 90 94, 95% white, and 5 to 6% folks of color. That's the general population. But if we drill down to our school-age population, there are places in the state where, you know, like in Brattleboro, 21, 22% of the school-age population are kids of color. Or in Winooski, it's 52%. Or in Rutland, it's 13, 14%. And we take a look at, this is what our population will look like 10 years from now, as these kids graduate from high school and then take their place either in colleges or you know, in our communities writ large. So the trail provides an opportunity for that emerging population. And that's not even to think about the 0 to 5 population, where statewide, 9% of the 0 to 5-year-olds are kids of color, which is almost double the statewide average. So we have, you know, a growing population coming up through our educational system. It's our future workforce. It's our future civic leaders that will be kids of color. So we need for them to have an anchor in their own community, in their own state, to know that there were sort of adults of color, and not only historical figures, but as well as contemporary leaders and folks. I think like the Charlotte, the Clemens family farm, where the matriarch and patriarch of the family are 93, 94 right now. But they're sort of a living history for the state. So those are the two reasons for the trail. The first of which is you know, to increase tourism to the state, and the second is to educate Vermonters as to their own history. Now, one of the challenges is getting communities to realize and to recognize that there's a market out there. And in some cases, it's a simple exercise of connecting the dots. When we unveiled the state historic marker commemorating the Buffalo Soldiers that stayed at Fort Ethan Allen from 1909 to 1913, we decided to invite motorcycle clubs, Black motorcycle clubs. In the landscape of motorcycle clubs, there are 2,000 plus. And about 10% of those motorcycle clubs carry the name Buffalo Soldier and Trooper. So what do you think we did? We've got a state historic marker in the state of Vermont commemorating Buffalo Soldiers. And here you have arguably the most philanthropic of all the motorcycle clubs, Black motorcycle clubs, that carry the name Buffalo Soldier and Trooper. So we invited the ones that were in the New England area for the inauguration. We got about 8 clubs that showed up, and they had a fantastic time. They spent who knows how much money on Church Street Marketplace. And they said most of them had never been to Vermont before. And they're from Connecticut or New Jersey or even the Boston area who had never been to Vermont. One, because no one thought to invite them. They had an experience that exceeded their expectations. And in my mailbox a couple of weeks ago, one of the clubs down in Hartford said, we want to come back to Vermont. We want to explore another part of the state. And we're tossing it up between either Grafton or Brownington, depending on how much time they want to spend. We tried to get them to spend overnight, but it might be a bit early for that. Maybe the next time they come, they'll spend 2 days and spend overnight. But in a really small way, what that does is it increases, our sales tax, revenue tax, rooms and board tax. People buy things in stores and boutiques and the like. And it's just a really small example of what can happen when you connect the dots. There are now 30 sites around the state. Most are within a 30-minute or 40-minute drive from any town in the state. And I think chambers of commerce, if they were savvy in sort of promoting their towns, to be able to use their nearest African American heritage site to promote their town, to bring in the New England area, folks from Albany or Boston or Springfield or Hartford or Bridgetown or Bridgeport, New York City, to bring folks to their communities on the strength of there's a reason for you to come. We have something really interesting for you to learn. A lot of people travel with their families, and families of color like to take their kids someplace where they can have fun, but where they can also learn something educational. The original sites were all kid tested. I dragged my 3 kids to field test each of the original 16 sites. And so and some of these sites have really developed over the years. Grafton now has the Birchdale camp ready for the public. They have a great interpretive center. Brownington has brought the Alexander Twilight Schoolhouse to their properties to complement the Old Stone House. The Clemens Family Farm has a distinctive mark in terms of the multicultural arts from the diaspora from around the world. They have great children's programs. They launched this during COVID, a curricula for elementary age kids. So there's a lot that's sort of happening. And there are times when people out of their own creative juices are working to expand the trail. And I want to talk a little bit before I turn it over to some questions about Lucy Terry Prince, who's in Guilford, and developing her story as one of the stories to be told on African American Heritage Trail. That will probably take place in 2023 when we update our brochure. But they're moving full steam ahead with a state historic marker. And she's already on the Words Project tour. So the other thing that we're working with in terms of the town of Brattleboro is the community marketing initiative that is really focusing on Black and Brown tourists within an 8-hour radius of Brattleboro to sort of attract and bring them here. And Lucy Terry Prince is a very important part of that narrative, as well as the Alec and Daisy Turner narrative in Grafton. So I'm going to leave it at that for the moment, and we'll take questions if Danny, if you're still with us. And I will drink some water take care of my singer's voice.
I'm hanging on every word. I'm definitely still here with you. This is totally fascinating, Curtis. Thank you. I know you've been dealing with some challenging health issues recently and feeling a little low energy. And on behalf of all of us, we're so grateful that you're taking this time and sharing with us. So thank you. And so I would encourage audience members who have questions and comments to begin submitting them in the Q&A box. And also, I'll ask for everyone's understanding if we can't manage to get through all of the questions. I really want to be respectful of Curtis's time and energy this evening. I see a couple coming in. I've jotted down a couple of things, Curtis, maybe just to get us started. Paraphrasing, you said that that there were really two goals for the trail, or maybe you were referring to the work of the partnership in general, but I think we were talking specifically about the trail. One basically being economic development, and the other being kind of a form of subliminal education for Vermonters. Mm-hmm. Is it working? Do you know if we're making progress in terms of economic development in the way that you envisioned, and in terms of educating kids?
Well, one of the challenges within the Department of Tourism and Marketing, who's our partner, is paltry data collection. Mm. All the sites are independently operated. We meet a couple times a year. I'm banging the drum with them, data. Mm-hmm. We had some interesting data in 2019 that suggested that there were more Black and brown drivers on the highway. This is a really bizarre thing that I really don't quite fully understand. But the Department of Public Safety captures numbers on, it's called crash data. This is crash data of individual vehicles that are in an accident of some sort or another. And they collect demographic data of who was involved. And there was like a 1.5 or 2% increase of drivers of color that were involved in accidents. And so we have no idea why that is. Maybe it's because kids are getting older. Maybe it's because of the trail, because these are license plates from out of state. So I mean, there's only anecdotal data. So we know that there are Black motorcyclists coming to Vermont. Who's going to capture that data?
Right. Wow. Okay. I was not expecting that.
Rokeby has had return visitors. Hildene has had return visitors, but we don't know if the visitation is expanding. But they are developing a relationship with tourists of color who come back with a different set of family members or a different set of friends.
Okay. Interesting. I mean, I get that good data collection can be really challenging and costly, and but it seems like, wow, we should get better at that fast.
Yeah. And also the Vermont Chamber of Commerce sort of promotes the state and the trail to bus tours. Folks coming up from the South, they come up for leaf peeping tours. They come up, but we're trying to get Black and brown tours, particularly churches, to come to Vermont in tour buses. And again, the data, they don't capture the data.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, all right, well, there's work to be done. Curtis, I'll share some of the questions and comments that are coming in here in the Q&A. First of all, Elizabeth kindly has shared the website for the trail. It's vtafricanamericanheritage.net. I don't know if everyone can see all the questions that are submitted in the Q&A, but it's vtafricanamericanheritage.net. And if you just Google Vermont African American Heritage Trail, you'll find other places where there's information about it on the web, including at the Department of Tourism and Marketing. Thank you,
Right.
Elizabeth. And
I'm doing a poor job at self-promotion, but the vtafricanamericanheritage.net is a website for educators. They can go to the site, they can download lesson plans, they can see the latest things that are happening at the various sites.
Great.
Then there's vermontvacations.com, which is really focused on tours.
Okay. Thank you. Elizabeth also asks, how can we make this more visible, like with hats and stuff, like the 251 Club has? For those of you who don't know, that Vermont has 251 towns, and so there's something called the 251 Club.
We have limited bandwidth of all that we could do. If Elizabeth wants to do some volunteer work and put together something, we'd be more than happy to have her. We do have geocaching with the original sites, but we haven't expanded beyond the first 16 sites to expand that.
Curtis, if there are people who would like to help, volunteer, or donate, or offer unsolicited advice, what's the best way for them to do that?
Probably the best way to do that is to go to the Vermont Partnership website.
Okay.
There's a contact page there. There's also a donation page, and those donations go to the Alana community organization that works on civic engagement and education programs related to the trail.
Great. And so that's Vermont Partnership for Fairness and Diversity is the full name of the organization. And
correct.
If people Google that, they'll find the website and get in touch that way.
Yes, it's vermontpartnership.org.
vermontpartnership.org. Okay, thank you. Anne says, from Anne, age 75 and recently moved to Heinsberg from Framingham, Mass., the first Massachusetts city with a Black female mayor. You mentioned that there were Black and brown people in Heinsberg before the revolution. Can you say a bit more?
Sure. There's an enclave that I think the earliest date was 1640. There's a state historic marker that is not far from there's a country store in Charlotte or in Heinsberg that is, if you go to the website, you'll be able to find it. But yes, there's a community in Heinsberg in the 1640s and 50s.
Wow.
A lot left after the Revolutionary War. The men who left to fight in the Revolutionary War didn't come back, many of them, and so the widows took their kids to other parts of the United States.
So Curtis, speaking of Black and brown people, people of color leaving Vermont, when I was listening to your potentially really encouraging population statistics about the numbers of school-age kids in Brattleboro, in Winooski, in Rutland, who are people of color, ages 0 through 5. Do we know anything about whether those kids, as they get older, are choosing to stay in Vermont? I mean, I have the impression that it's an issue for Vermont in general, that our young people are leaving the state. I wonder if we know anything more specific than that about young people of color growing up here and then leaving or not, potentially coming back?
Yeah, there are a lot that are leaving, of all races. And I mean, my 3 kids are on the West Coast. Go figure. The trail didn't do them a whole lot of good in terms of keeping them here. But from a sort of a kind of holistic view, if we don't plant the seed that Vermont is a desirable destination to stay, or let's say you leave the state for a college education and come back, we haven't done a good enough job at implanting that particular seed. I say that would be across the board, but it's even more critically important for families of color, because if we expand our economy in such a way that is attracting more businesses of color, more tourists of color, people want to see themselves reflected in our communities. They don't want to come up and have, ooh, I'm a pioneering country experience.
Right.
But that there's some flavor, as we would say,
Right.
that this is a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial, multilingual destination. And we can't do that effectively when the multilingual, the multiracial, the multi-ethnic decide to leave the state because they don't see a place for themselves as adults in the state.
For sure. Yeah, thank you. How about, you okay taking a few more questions and responding to a few more comments?
I'm good for the moment. Yes.
Okay. So Molly writes, first off, thank you, Curtis. Second, thank you so much for the suggestion encouraging chambers of commerce to link to their local African American Heritage Trail site. This is a very easy, actionable step, and I will bring it to our chamber. Thank you. Thank you, Molly. That's great. Molly also writes, also just recently, Clemens Family Farm and Catamount Arts have partnered to bring artists from the Vermont African American African Diaspora Artists Network to the Northeast Kingdom. The series will be launched soon and is called the NEK Black Performing Arts Series. The arts are proven economic drivers.
Yes, and although they're not on the trail, JAG Productions, they're in White River Junction, has become a hub for the multicultural arts scene, particularly the theatrical arts, theater arts.
And when you're talking about there needing to be some flavor, that people can relate to and latch onto and engage with, I feel like you're really, shining a big light at arts. There's a lot that we in the arts can do to be helpful in that way in particular.
Yeah, we're just moving off topic just a little bit, but places like the Vermont Jazz Center and the museum, Words Trail, are all opportunities for the chamber and the Downtown Brattleboro Association to get behind and say, you may already know that they hired the Blue Whale public relations firm to really target the BIPOC commuter or consumer to come to Vermont, or to come to Brattleboro specifically. There's a lot there.
It's as we were saying earlier, it's not just the moral imperative. There's a huge economic upside. Potential for huge economic upside as well.
Indeed.
Fatima writes, what are some opportunities for Black people who have just moved out of Vermont, who have just, I'm not sure if she's saying who have just moved out of Vermont or who have just moved to Vermont to feel more at home? And probably who have just moved to Vermont to feel more at home. My partner and I have lived here since August, and it's been hard building a community because of COVID, but also because we aren't aware of events where we can meet more people of color.
Okay, in the grand scheme of life, if you're a couch potato, you will not be able to discover all that Vermont has to offer. They can go to our website, IamAVermonter.org. We've filled out southeastern Vermont. That will meet 30 or so really interesting Vermonters of color that live in Windham County. But depending on where they came from, if they're in Chicago or LA, where it would take a 45-minute to an hour drive to get from one end of the city to the next end of the city, that time could be spent driving to Rutland. Paramount Theater has a lot of multicultural events. Yeah, I saw Stomp when they came through. The Barry Opera House had the Michael Jackson Review Band about 5 years ago. There are, the Flynn Center up in Burlington, where they had fences. They had red tails about the Tuskegee Airmen happening. So we have yet to, and again, these are projects. If someone would want to take on the project of a multicultural event calendar for the state of Vermont, that'd be great. I mean, we have limited bandwidth of what we can do. And it takes money, it takes energy, it takes being technologically savvy to be able to pull this off. I mean, Brattleboro had over 1,000 cultural events over the course of a year. How many of those cultural events were of a multicultural nature? Every year the Brattleboro Literary Festival has writers of color to come in or illustrators to talk about their work. The Women's Film Festival, has films about the diaspora. The Vermont Jazz Center has a rotating series of world-class artists to come here. We have the Asian Cultural Center of Vermont in West Brattleboro that is doing phenomenal work in exhibits. So if we had a platform that was collecting this information around the state, it'd be a lot easier to, let your fingers do the walking, one click. And and whether it's African drumming or whether it's Ethiopian tea ceremonies or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I just want to add to that list, and you mentioned them earlier, but Vermont Jazz Center, what an incredible resource in Brattleboro, bringing some of the absolute top, finest jazz musicians in the world through Brattleboro on a regular basis. And for what it's worth, I'll add that spotlighting multicultural voices and perspectives has become more and more of an area of emphasis for the Brattleboro Museum as well. It's, I think, really in ample evidence right now with the range of exhibits we have out. But we are not thinking of this as just a one-time, one spring thing. It's this is a this is a priority for us for the foreseeable future.
Right.
So yeah, I love the idea of figuring out how to aggregate a lot of that, and so people who are asking have easier access to that info. And so here's another smaller, possibly simpler answer, which is Jerome has suggested in the chat, join our village on Facebook called Black and Brown Vermont. Thank you, Jerome. Jerome has also written, hello, Curtis, excellent job. Jerome Lafayette Naramore of Black and Brown Facebook group here. It's been my experience in trying to promote Black and Brown perspectives that entities have been apathetic. Our hometown of Castleton, once having the highest totals of Black folk, was also met with a high level of racism and intolerance. It's my job to promote our history in the state. My novel is in the works and a series based upon it is being developed. We need to have more visibility.
Yes, and Castleton is one of those unsung sites. There's a cemetery of Black slate quarry workers that's in Castleton. We've not been, it's been rumored to be in Castleton, but we've not actually found it yet. So if Jerome has any insight into the grave sites of Black slate quarry workers, that'd be great. And it is. I mean, well, the reason that we don't approach this work from a social or moral standpoint is that people are willing to argue up and down that slippery slope. When you talk about money, when you talk about dollars and how this can enrich your community, all of a sudden the conversation changes. It's not out of some philanthropic effort that this is happening, but it's happening because we need more consumers, we need more visitors to our towns, we need them to spend more dollars, we need them to eventually decide that they had an experience that will bring them back to Vermont or to that particular town. But if you just wish for it and don't do anything about it, your economic circumstances will be static, which is why we're really excited about the community marketing initiative in Brattleboro that is specifically targeting visitors of color. Yeah.
Just not to beat a dead horse, but just as an aside, I hope that there are plans with that initiative to try to do some data collection that will enable us in Brattleboro to know, how fruitful those efforts were and where we can, how we can do even better going forward. And speaking of which, Jean submitted a comment, must have been earlier when we were talking about data collection, saying data collection sounds dull, but it's vital for understanding what's happening with our economy and the well-being of our communities. I hope there will be better tourist data coming soon. You're here. Bonnie writes, Montpelier Museum should also be a venue to expand this information. They have an exhibit on the KKK in Vermont. I wonder if Bonnie's referring to the Vermont Historical Society or another institution in Montpelier, but thank you for that note, Bonnie. Susan writes, what an opportunity for interns to spend a summer collating information from each established site as a gift to schools and libraries all over the state. Is there the bandwidth in the organization to initiate something like this?
We have a gazillion and one plans, but it's not the plans themselves that are the important thing. It is how do we motivate people to take these on and run with them? That we're like Johnny Appleseed. We travel around the countryside, plant a few seeds here, a few seeds there. They get watered, take root, a tree, and you have apples. Much of our work over the last 20 years has been like that. Like I said, we're in year 18 of this 40-year initiative. And in many cases, it's simply connecting people to a vision that will take them someplace that they hadn't anticipated going to. And so all these great ideas, the calendar, the interns, I mean, it'd be great, for example, for each of the sites, particularly Brownington and Rokeby, Hildene, and Grafton, to have Black docents that tell the story. So to have a college student, assume the personage of Daisy Turner,
Right.
to talk to visitors as they come in, or Alexander Twilight, or one of the Pullman porters. I mean, there's also an opportunity for sort of a cottage industry around the trail, around trail sites.
I would imagine. There seems to be like an umbrella issue emerging, which is, it sounds, Curtis, like we're at a point in the evolution of this work where we're not lacking for ideas at this moment. What's lacking maybe are the resources and the real step-by-step plan for implementing a significant number of these ideas. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that would be fair to say. And I would say, in addition to that, these are activities that are economically driven. And if you don't have the passion and the intestinal fortitude to start a business, because all these could be potential businesses.
Sure, yeah.
That end up hiring people, that end up, utilizing goods and services. So there's an entrepreneurial gold mine around the African American Heritage Trail for an entrepreneur or entrepreneurs that are so inclined. Some of them are low-hanging fruit, and I think the lowest of the hanging fruit is aggregating the cultural events around the state into an online platform. Sell advertising on that site, and you have a baked-in audience that want to know what are the cultural events, and it makes the jobs of the sites that much easier, and of the chambers that much easier. I mean, all the chambers of commerce should pool their funds together to create such a site. It's focused on a distinct audience to which they don't currently have very little access to.
Yeah. It's interesting and instructive to me to hear you keep coming back to the entrepreneurial angle and the potential for profit. I've worked my whole adult life in nonprofits, so that's not where my mind goes initially. But I feel like some of these initiatives would also make some of the most appealing grant applications to philanthropic groups that are looking for opportunities to support multicultural activities in Vermont.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to be an either or. I could see an internship program being funded through initially being funded through a nonprofit that submits a compelling grant application, and some of these other activities that we've been discussing being primarily driven like by the market and from an entrepreneurial standpoint. It just seems like there's a lot of potential there. Curtis, we just have a couple final comments and questions here. I thank all of you for your involvement and participation in these wonderful comments and questions. Jerry Carboni, our wonderful former librarian at the Brooks Memorial Library in Brattleboro.
Right. A great Italian cook, by the way.
Yeah, right. Ann Dempsey of Rockingham Public Library wrote a 5-part historical series on Black Brattleboro in February 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 1994 to celebrate African American History Month.
Right.
It's available using newspapers.com via free account. Oh, I see. So it was a 5-part historical series appearing in the newspaper on 5 successive days. Got it. And it's available using newspapers.com via free account at Vermont State Archives. Register for an account here, and Jerry provides the link, and that's in the Q&A, and I'll also copy it over into the chat. Wonderful. Thank you, Jerry.
Yes. And Ann and I have a very dear friend named Bernice Lewis. He was a teacher at BUHS for decades, who died maybe 10 years ago or so. We would love to do something in Bernice's name that's related to the African American Heritage Trail, whether it is a poetry contest or an essay contest of some sort. But this is to really in the memory of this African American teacher at BUHS.
Wonderful. Okay, we're coming to the end here. Peter writes, I recently learned of the Brace family reunion, Black Vermonters for over 200 years. I would love to see a Black Vermonter family reunion.
A Black Vermonter family
reunion.
A reunion.
Yeah.
Well, we had in Rutland last Thursday, in fact, the great grandson of Martin Henry Freeman, whose statue or whose sculpture was unveiled in Rutland, came back to Rutland for the inauguration, and to boot, announced that his family was setting up a scholarship fund for Rutlanders. They're in the preliminary discussions of creating a scholarship fund to give back to the community that their great grandfather, where he lived, where he was born and raised.
Fantastic. What a meaningful thing.
Mm-hmm.
Curtis, the last question I have for you, being as this is an event organized by the Art Museum, I can't not ask you about that beautiful tapestry that's on the wall behind you.
Oh, okay. This is a Berber tapis or rug.
Mm-hmm.
It's about 100 years old. I
wow.
picked it up in Tunisia in the, I think 1983, 1984, somewhere along there. It was 50 years old then. And it is hanging from, which you might not be able to see.
Oh my God.
Well, the ironwork was by African blacksmiths. And all the tapestries that I have are hung off of those. You should come by.
I would love to.
Someone, Lynn Barrett came to my apartment and she said, "Oh, you're a collector." And I'm thinking, collector? What is that?
Yeah.
So she's like, put me into this world of being a collector. And I do have an amazing collection of African art, and sculptures and tapestries and textiles. And so and my Brooks House apartment is the perfect place to display, because there's not a square wall in in the unit that I'm in. So,
I would love to come by sometime.
okay, well, now that we're both totally vaccinated.
Same, yeah.
So, yeah, bring lunch. You
Okay,
be part of my recovery by bringing lunch.
All right, that's a deal. That sounds perfect. I would love to do that.
Okay.
Curtis, I think we're going to wrap it up there. Before we sign off, I just want to let everyone know that a recording of this event tonight will be available on the museum's website within the next day or two. That's brattleboromuseum.org. If you go there, you can also check out the recordings of the other events we've done in this series and dozens of other events we've presented online over the past year. When you go to the website, you'll find those under events and then video archives.
Right.
Of course, if you happen to be in the Brattleboro area, I encourage one and all to come to the museum for an actual in-person, non-screen-based art experience. We're open Wednesday through Sunday, 10 to 4. You can make a reservation on our website or just drop in, whichever you prefer. Admission is on a pay-as-you-wish basis, and we're very grateful that people are being very generous when they can in paying to come to the museum. But we feel strongly that we don't want admission to be a barrier to entry for anyone. So it's pay as you wish if you come to the Brattleboro Museum. And come before June 13th, and you can see Jennifer Mack-Watkins' amazing exhibit inspired by Daisy Turner and related to the Vermont African American Heritage Trail and more. You can see that in person along with, we actually have 6 or 7 other terrific exhibits up right now through June 13th. So we'd love to see you. Normally at this stage, I say that if you've enjoyed tonight's event and would like to make a donation to support this type of free programming, the museum would be very grateful for that, which is absolutely true. And that is something you can do at our website, brattleboromuseum.org. But I would also encourage anyone who's feeling generous this evening to go to vermontpartnership.org and consider making a donation to Curtis's wonderful organization.
Great.
Curtis, thank you again. This was a true pleasure. It's great to see you and to hear about the amazing work that you've done for our state and are still doing. So thank you.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to speak longer than a 20-second soundbite.
Anytime.
Great.
And to everyone else in the audience, thank you again for being here and participating tonight. Stay safe, take good care of yourselves and each other. Hope to see you soon. Good night.
Good night.